The high priest held the iron blade steady over the child's token and spoke a short, precise line of invocation as the mother pressed her palms together and did not move. Fear held the mother's fingers like a lock. The archivist watched that stiffness from the doorway and catalogued every gesture. Fear is the thread that runs through the courtyard that evening, and it guides the archivist's questions. Who decided, who coerced, and who profited? The acolyte looked away, hands clenched at his sides, and the priest's jaw did not betray him. The altar smoke steamed into the salt air, and the child-shaped bundle smoldered at the edge of the pyre. The archivist did not speak. He had come prepared with notes and a thin brass magnifier on its chain. He had read the ledger entries and seen the names, but he had not been prepared for how a single small wrist could translate into everyone's duty. He touched the grimoire in his coat to steady himself, and watched the mother make a furtive motion, fingers seeking something under her robe, and then flattening them again. Suspicion shifted toward urgency in his chest as he catalogued that motion and stored it for later interrogation. He stepped forward the next day into the museum's storeroom and pried open a rusted crate with the curator. The crate gave like old wood finally conceding. Inside lay a child-shaped figurine blackened by heat and a soot-stained ledger with names written in a cramped hand. "Look at this," the museum curator. Voice low and businesslike, ledger tags, family names, dates that line up with layers we found at the dig. The archivist turned each page with gloved fingers. The ledger named households that appeared prosperous in other records. The ledger ties them to the sanctuary. The archivist, not voluntary dedications. Look, notations beside the names mark amounts, and for the God's will, the curator tapped the suit margins. They recorded commodities given by merchants when a child's name appears. That pattern repeats. The archivist's suspicion hardened into a hypothesis. He would test it in the field. He packed rubbings and a photocopy of the ledger into a soft case and left the storeroom with a list of questions. At the coastal trench, dawn smelled of wet stone and iron. The field archaeologist knelt beside a shallow pit and scraped with a trowel. "Charcoal here concentrated," she said. "Small post, holes, clustered. Infant-size pits sealed with thin slabs." She lifted a shard with gloved tweezers, bronze amulet. "See the loop. Merchant marks on the reverse." The archivist leaned down until his breath fogged the trench lip and read the faint stamp. A name echoed the ledger's entries. He felt a shift from academic curiosity to the need for ethical clarity. He wrote the name on his pad and underlined it twice. The merchant representative arrived by mid-morning with a sealed bundle and a combative posture. He wore a long oilcloth coat that had weathered sea salt and trade routes. "You cannot accuse my house without proof," he said. "These marks prove only trade links." The archivist showed him the ledger photocopy and the amulet photograph. "These join the sanctuary's records to your family." The archivist. Why would a merchant list contributions next to children's names? The merchant representative ran a hand through his hair and kept answering with business phrases. The field archaeologist placed a charred figurine on the table and did not speak. Confrontation arrived in small, precise strokes. "You signed for bronze deliveries to the sanctuary on these dates." The archivist. "Your name appears beside offerings that match the pit's dates. Those were offerings, not burials," the merchant representative insisted. "Offerings were symbolic." The field archaeologist cut in. "The soil chemistry shows traces of burned bone in several pits." The merchant representative's shoulders tightened. "Then maybe mercenary cults acted without consulate oversight." The archivist watched the representative avoid saying the word "we." That avoidance was itself data. The archivist convened a cramped reading room session with a skeptical historian who specialized in ritual symbolism. The room smelled of glue and dry vellum. "Symbols can be substitutions," the historian said briskly, flipping through copies of classical texts. "We have evidence across the Mediterranean of token offerings replacing living sacrifice. Yet the soil reports show burned bone and infant teeth." The archivist countered. "And the ledger lists family names and amounts." The historian tapped a margin. "Those amounts could be temple fees, not payments for human lives." The archivist folded his hands and tested the historian's certainty with a direct question. What would make a mother hand over a child if there were no compulsion? The historian's answer did not satisfy him. That answer, or lack of one, pushed the archivist back into the field. He questioned villagers on a windswept hill where one of the excavation pits lay half exposed. The village elder led him by the wrist into a scrubbed yard and pointed to a low stone. The elder's voice was flat. "We were told prosperity came when we gave what the god required," she said. "The merchant, priests told us storms would end, fields would yield. The city favored those who sacrificed." The archivist watched her fingers trace a seam in the stone and then fold away. Her tone held shame and resignation. Her actions were small and precise: dropped eyes, a throat cleared, a knuckled hand rubbing the wrist of the other. Doubt shifted toward anger in the archivist as he catalogued the elder's admissions. He noted how she emphasized the merchant's words. He, the village elder, to recall a name. She named one merchant family who had provided oil and grain during a recent famine, and whose emblem matched the amulet. "They gave us help when we needed it," she said slowly, "but they said the goddess, Jews must still be paid." The archivist wrote each sentence without commentary. The village elder's posture suggested relief at confessing. She had been carrying the detail physically and now set it down. A mid-morning discovery intervened. The field archaeologist lifted a sandstone slab and exposed a narrow chamber. Inside, small bundled deposits lay in rows. Among them, a string of beads with a child's name incised on a bone pendant. The archivist's breath shortened, and he felt an immediate nausea that he translated into action. He called for the trench to be covered, for samples to be bagged, and for the local representative to be notified. This external event forced the narrative to accelerate. Back in the museum lab that night, the archivist compared chemical assays with the ledger's dates and found concordance. Some entries matched only figurine dedications, traces of plant resins and votive ash. Other entries matched deposits with burned bone and infant tooth enamel. He read a fragment of a ritual tablet whose language indicated substitution in some rites and bodily offerings in others. He found a note added by a temple scribe. "When grain is short, the god takes the sign. When prosperity wanes, the god asks for weight." The archivist's earlier suspicion reconfigured into a specific hypothesis. A deliberate dual practice had existed, used strategically by those in power. He brought that hypothesis to the skeptical historian in the reading room and demanded a rapid exchange if substitution happened only when convenience allowed it. Then what determines convenience? The archivist money influence. Which families could be compelled without losing trade? The skeptical historian rubbed his temple and then spoke quicker. "You claim caution. Provide direct evidence linking merchants and priests to enforced rites." The archivist slid the ledger photocopies and the amulet photograph across the table. The historian skimmed and then read aloud dates that matched the buried pits. He stopped at a line and did not speak for a full breath. In the silence, both men recalculated. The archivist's doubt changed into urgency when the village elder arrived at the museum with a sealed clay token and a thin voice. She refused to come inside. She handed the token over at the threshold and then did not meet the archivist's eyes. "I cannot say everything in public," she whispered. "They will still listen to the merchants. I fear for the children who remain." Her fingers shook as she furled the token. The archivist felt the shift in responsibility press against his ribs. He organized a targeted excavation outside the coastal village where local memory and ledger clues converged. The team cleared scrub with measured sweeps. The field archaeologist uncovered a concealed burial pit that had been camouflaged under a shepherd's path. She lifted a corroded bronze pendant and then pulled back the soil to reveal clustered deposits that matched the infant-sized pits found earlier. The village elder stood at the edge and placed a palm over her mouth. "This is what we hid," she said. "We did it because we were forced or threatened. I cannot say more in front of those who still profit." The archivist watched her eyes go to the horizon and then drop. At that moment the climax arrived and altered the story. The buried pit contained dozens of small deposits and personal tokens, beads, amulets, and scraps of garments. Among them were ledger, linked items with merchant stamps, and a folded note written in a priest's hand. The note was short: "When the city needs balance, take the dues. Keep trade intact." The archivist felt a concrete shift from ambiguity to accusatory clarity. He ran his gloved finger along the note. The skin of his hand registered sweat and salt from the sea air. He read the word balance, and then the signature mark. The team stood in silence long enough for action to arrive. The village elder: "They made us think it was a pact." The priests and merchants set the price. "We buried the children in shame and silence so the city could keep trading." The merchant representative tried to reclaim the narrative later that day. Speaking sharply at the excavation tent, "You cannot blame the city on a ledger entry," he said. "Those were offerings in extreme times." The field archaeologist interrupted. "The soil shows human remains. These pits are intimates, not tokens." The merchant representative's voice faltered, then hardened, then blame the old famine. Blame the weather. That attempt to shift the cause felt like one more piece of evidence. In a cramped lab, the archivist forced exchanges between the field archaeologist and the skeptical historian. The field archaeologist held a tooth fragment under a lamp. "This enamel yields a child's isotope signature. Diet and weaning patterns match infants between 2 and 18 months. The archivist, the historian, a direct, brusque question. Would symbolic substitution ever require naming families and matching merchant marks? The historian looked at the ledger, then at the tooth, and then at the sequence of charred deposits. He breathed and then said, "Not without social pressure." The ledger's entries read like accounting with coercive notation. That concession shifted the debate in the room from theoretical to prosecutorial. The archivist called the museum curator and the village elder into the curatorial office the next afternoon to decide how to present the finds. The curator was practical. "We have a duty to inform the public," she said, "but we must protect descendants and avoid inflaming modern tensions." The village elder pressed a hand to her chest and said, "We will not let our dead be spectacle. We want truth, but we want dignity." The archivist listened to both and watched his own hands fold the ledger photocopy and the priest's folded note. He felt an emotional pivot. He must choose between full disclosure and careful contextualization. They negotiated details like professionals who had seen similar fights. The curator suggested an exhibit that contextualized ritual economics without naming living families. The village elder wanted community consultation and an oral history panel. The archivist proposed including the ledger pages as reproductions with redacted family names and a clear summary of the chemical findings. "Redact merchant marks tied to living lineages," the archivist, "but do not hide the ledger's pattern. Hide names when necessary, not facts." The curator nodded but hesitated on the scope of redaction. The village elder closed her eyes and then said, "We will accept that compromise if it spares our children more harm." The archivist recorded those terms. At night, in a private study, he assembled reproduction plates and wrote a short report. He typed a concrete concluding line that refused grand philosophy. "The evidence shows a structured practice of substitution in some rites and bodily offerings in others. Coercion and merchant, priest collusion explain the difference." He folded the plates into an archival envelope and sealed it with tape. He placed the charred figurine beside the ledger photocopy and then stepped back to measure what both objects demanded of him. The archivist knew the choice he would present to the curator in the morning. The final decision arrived as a knock at the door. The museum curator's hand appeared in the doorway with a cup of tea and the municipal representative's letter, "We must finalize the label text," she said. The archivist turned the envelope over in his hands and felt the ledger's weight. He set the envelope into the curator's hands and said, "We will redact living names and include the priest's note verbatim. We will present the evidence and the community's call for dignity." The curator exhaled and then proposed a modest plaque acknowledging the village elder's testimony. The elder's earlier plea had moved the choice away from sensationalism. They agreed on wording that balanced disclosure and protection. The archivist watched the museum curator fold the reproduction plates into a crate and fasten the lid with a practiced motion. That final physical act settled the immediate conflict. The archivist did not write an elegy. He placed the charred figurine into a padded box and closed it. The village elder touched the box rim with the pads of her fingers and said quietly, "Now at least they will be seen with care." The archivist locked the office and left with the ledger photocopy under his arm. Outside, wind from the sea cleared his head in plain, physical terms. He felt the shift from doubt to responsibility and then to cautious resolution. He had exposed a pattern. When trade and scarcity intersected, power concentrated, and some households paid the ultimate cost. The ledger and the priest's note supplied documentary evidence that altered how the community understood past rituals. The archivist folded his coat tighter, adjusted the magnifier on its chain, and walked toward the quay with the curator's crate on a cart behind him. He carried the resolved material decisions with concrete instructions and a plan for community panels. He had not resolved every moral question. He had, however, made a clear evidentiary choice and a public one. The ledger pages would be shown, names redacted for living descendants. The priest's note would be included to demonstrate institutional role. The village elder would have a voice in the exhibit narrative. The archivist felt an ending in the act of handing over the sealed packet. He had confronted the ledger, the pits, the merchant marks, and the priest's note. He had made choices about exposure and care. That night, before lantern light, he recorded a brief inventory and sealed the reproduction plates in a crate labeled for the exhibit. He wrote a single directive on his pad: protect dignity. Present facts. He sent a message to the field archaeologist requesting further isotope tests, and to the skeptical historian asking for a joint public note on substitution practices. Then he walked to the quay and watched a small ferry cut a white line across the harbor. He felt a tired steadiness rather than triumph. The archivist had moved fear into documentation and into action. Outside the museum door, the curator lingered a moment. "You did not leave the ledger's names in print," she said softly. "You chose restraint." The archivist folded his hands and felt the calluses along his fingertips, as if they carried the weight of his choices. "The ledger must speak," he said. "But it should not wound those alive now." She looked at him, then at the sealed crate, and nodded. The village elder's earlier whispered line, "They will still listen to the merchants," had driven the evidence to a public format that minimized further harm. He walked home with the sea wind in his hair and the brass magnifier soft against his chest. The archivist had resolved the chapter's immediate moral conflict by choosing disclosure with redaction and by creating forums that allowed surviving community members to speak. He had transformed fear into an investigatory push and then into procedural safeguards. At his desk, he laid down the final plate, closed the ledger folder, and paused only to note a practical task. Arrange translation of the priest's note and schedule the public panel. He sealed the crate with tape and, as the curator closed the door behind her, he heard a final, small sound. Someone knocking from the street, delivering a petition. He opened the door and found a neighbor with a list of witness names wanting to speak at the panel. The archivist took the list, folded it into his pocket, and then locked the office. The final scene of the chapter is concrete. He set the sealed crate on a cart for the curator to move, took the neighbor's list, and walked to the panel room to prepare a proper, public presentation. At dawn, a gloved hand pried a charred cluster of tiny bones from the coastal trench, and the lead archaeologist shouted for silence. Suspicion tightened the archivist's jaw and pushed him forward across the damp sand to the exposed pit. The central problem was immediate and concrete. These remains were not stray refuse but deliberately placed deposits. The archivist crouched, lifted the bronze child-shaped amulet with tweezers, and watched the temple emissary arrive with a straight gait and a face like flint. "What have you found?" The emissary demanded. "This belongs to the sanctuary," he added, stepping between the trench and the team. The scene unfolded with hot, practical motions. Dre. Helena Cruz, the lead archaeologist, took off her mask and spoke in short, clipped sentences. "Helena, stop, let me see it. Amun. Step back, Amun." The voices were direct. They did not linger on theory. The archivist recorded the discovery into his field notebook with slow, precise strokes, noting soot lattices on the bones and crusted olive oil residue on the amulet's rim. In 5 sentences the stakes were visible. An ecclesiastical agent claimed ownership. The excavation had produced probable ritual materials, and civic authority might be compelled to intervene. That possibility shifted the immediate priority from cataloging to protection of evidence. The archivist's movement was governed by suspicion and procedure. He tapped the amulet with a brass magnifier, then wrapped it in acid-free cloth. "Archivist, we must photograph the context," he told the team. Helena snapped images while Elias, the young acolyte assigned to the dig, whispered the names of layers into the recorder. The emissary, Amun, kept his distance and watched each action like a ledger keeper watching receipts. The archivist felt the first emotion shift. Suspicion loosening into guarded anger when Amun tried to pull the amulet into his own cloak. "Amun, you cannot remove that." Helena, we have protocol." Amun. "The sanctuary will not be insulted," Amun replied. His tone was flat. Lucan, the magistrate's representative, arrived with a clerk and a stamped letter that smelled faintly of wet river paper. He read aloud. "By order of the magistrate, no disturbance of sanctuary property." The sentence landed on the trench like a slab. The team paused. The archivist closed his notebook and knelt to scoop a sample of charred soil into a labeled vial. Within the next hour the field tent became a locus of confrontation. In a narrow space between the chilled air of the coast and the heated argument inside the tent, Helena and Lucan circled like 2 professionals negotiating damage control. "Helena, we will record everything," Helena insisted. "Lucan, the magistrate has already decided." "Lucan, Helena, you cannot just hand artifacts over without analysis." The archivist watched Helena's jaw tighten. She catalogued the amulet's patina with fingers that did not shake. Elias stood near the bench and kept his eyes on the archivist. Elias's hands trembled slightly when he handed the archivist a tiny clear bag of soot fragments. Elias's delivery introduced the first unexpected turn. The soot carried faint, deliberate incisions. The archivist set the bag beneath the magnifier and traced a pattern of repeated scorched lines. "Archivist, these are not random burn marks. They are arranged to hold something smaller." Helena bent forward, voice low. "Helena, that pattern matches descriptions in the coastal talismans. We've seen this before in votive catches." Ammon's face did not change. Lucan scribbled and looked away. The emotional tenor shifted again from guarded anger to urgency. The archivist began to press for formal recording while feeling the growing pressure of local authority. A midday summons forced the group into a cramped priory chamber. High Priest Bol Melik sat at the head of a low table, hands folded, the linen sleeves of his robe edged in dull gold. He spoke without raising his voice. "Bol Melik, you dig where the sanctuary sleeps. You awaken what should remain undisturbed." The high priestess' composure was a tool. He invoked order and consequence. He named potential unrest. His argument was precise. Exposure of offerings could provoke communal grief and riots. The magistrate's representative, Lucan, shifted his weight and nodded to the idea of political stability over archaeological certainty. The archivist objected. speaking in measured phrases that clipped at Ball, Milik's assumptions, archivist. If this is evidence, the public record must note it. We cannot erase signs of death, Ball, Melik. The record exists in the sanctuary, Ball, Melik replied. The conversation tightened into a practical negotiation about custody and public safety. Helena pushed for permits. Lucan offered a compromise, an inspection team under magistrate's seal. The archivist watched Ball, Melik's hands, the collused fingertips that reminded him of priests who handled knives and ledgers equally. He thought of the earlier memory, the high priest who had held an iron blade over a child's token in another room. And the present calm took on an edge of intent. At the high priest's private chamber, the archivist a question that cut to the root. Alone, he said. Archivist. Why children? Why this trade off? Baal Melik's eyes narrowed. Baal Melik. It is insurance, he said softly. Baal Melik. A small death prevents a great one. Families pledge for protection they cannot secure by other means. He described ritual logic with the matter of fact cadence of a man recounting a ledger entry. The archivist did not accept the theological frame at face value. He about records. Baal Melik smiled briefly and withdrew his hand, producing a folded sheet with neat charcoal lines, an inventory of offerings that listed no names. The high priest refused to hand over the larger archive, Baal Melik. Some things are the sanctuary's alone, he said. That refusal hardened the archivist's resolve. He left the chamber with a clipped reply. Outside, he recorded the encounter in language precise enough to be admissible. A refusal under the pretense of preservation. The emotional shift here moved from questioning to determination. The archivist rehearsed steps in his head, where to look, whom to ask, what to preserve before evidence could be removed. Back at the lab tent, Elias found him and slipped something into his palm. A torn strip of pottery, edges chewed by time, scored with tally marks and hastily inked names. Elias spoke in a rush of near confession. Elias, I should have taken this. They forbid us. Elias' voice dropped. He looked at Baal Melik's robes in memory and swallowed Elias. Families paid. Names were written. I copied one ledger page to hide. The archivist felt the ledger fragment's weight as both material and accusation. He unfolded it and read names that matched local merchant families and civic registries. The pattern changed how he understood the ritual. It was not only spiritual exchange but a recorded, routinized transaction that tied elites to the sanctuary. Helena stepped close and read the pottery strip over his shoulder. Helena, if this is authentic, this makes them creditors, not just worshippers. Her tone sharpened. The twist altered the team's priorities. Lucan, when told, briefly paled and left the tent to speak privately with a magistrate aide. The magistrate's office returned with a sterile notice. The site would be closed, pending reconciliation of property claims. The archivist realized the ledger fragment made the sanctuary vulnerable. Those implicated could choose concealment or coercion. That realization led to a rapid exchange that changed the direction of events. Helena, we must copy everything now, Helena insisted. Lucan. You risk arrest for tampering, Lucan warned. Elias, they will punish me. Elias, the archivist moved methodically. He photographed the pottery under a cold lantern, traced the tally marks with ink on a separate sheet, and placed the original fragment between two glass plates. He felt the utility of small, deliberate actions. They preserved evidence even as institutions moved to erase it. Night fell before the team could breathe. The sanctuary courtyard lit by braziers became a stage. Priests in dark robes moved like censors. Magistrate guards advanced in files. When the seizure began, the archivist had a precise plan. Copy, pocket micro samples, and if necessary, run. The first clash was physical and immediate. A temple guard grabbed at a child's token displayed on a low bench. Temple guard. That is ours! He shouted. Helena pushed forward and tried to shield a tray of pottery. Helena. Hands off the catalogue, she said. The archivist shoved a stack of copied notes into his coat and felt the fabric pull at his patched elbow. The confrontation escalated into its climax. The high priest moved among the scuffle, hands steady, and reached for a child-shaped token. The archivist lunged, fingers scraping stone, and attempted to seize the token back. A guard struck the archivist's shoulder, and he went down onto grime. The token hit the floor and fractured with a brittle sound. Someone shouted the priest's name, Bal Milik. Stop that. The sound was calm and controlled, but the courtyard was a noise of boots and metal. Documents scattered. Candles toppled and coated the soil with wax. The raid turned into a physical attempt to erase evidence. The archivist tasted grit and smelled sulfur from torches. In the melee, Helena and Elias worked like a tandem. Helena shoved a wrapped bundle of photographs into the archivist's hands. Helena, "Get them away," she said. Elias thrust forward with a sealed vial of soot. Elias, "Take this to the archive," he said. Lucan barked orders that tried to split the team. The archivist felt the second major emotion shift from resolute determination to acute fear when guards forced records from their hands. Fear manifested as an immediate tightening in his chest and a stinging bruise on his shoulder where the guard had struck him. He used the fear as fuel to latch onto a single objective: preserve copies. The seizure ended not with ceremony but with procedural coldness. Early morning found numbered crates leaving the site under magistrate's seal. The magistrate's representative issued a brief, sanitized statement about public safety and custody. Helena was required to sign a compliance form that would later be cited as consent. The archivist watched crates pass into the magistrate's wagon. He catalogued numbers and the names stamped on the seals. The community's public face of order masked coordinated suppression. The archivist's notes became his private ledger of what had been taken. After the raid, the team dispersed into smaller acts of preservation. In a shaded archive alcove, the archivist set out his copies on a wood table. His hands were steady, but his mouth tasted of iron. Elias stayed nearby, eyes on the door. "Elias, they will come after you." The archivist quietly, "Elias, I know," Elias replied. He slid a folded scrap of paper across the table. The scrap bore a name and an address, a merchant family that kept private ledgers. "Elias, they keep their own books. If you want the ledger, go to the market's back alley on the third stall. Ask for Miro's account," Elias whispered. That exchange was a small earthquake. The merchant ledger represented a path out of institutional erasure. The archivist put his palm over the pottery strips, copied lines, and felt a new sequence of choices arrange themselves: legal petition, clandestine inquiry, alliance with merchants. He wrote a methodical plan. First, verify the pottery fragment sync with a lab sample. Second, find Miro's account. Third, secure a copy of the merchant ledger. Every step included risk. The archivist's face was angular in the lamplight, and he touched the brass magnifier on its chain in a habitual gesture. At noon, the magistrate's office informed Helena that her field permit was temporarily suspended pending review. Lucan delivered the news with an economy of words. "Lucan, the magistrate cannot endorse further disturbance," he said. "Helena, you are closing the site even with evidence." Helena demanded. "Lucan, you have options. Appeal in writing or accept magistrate mediation," Lucan replied. The exchange had 3 quick retorts that sounded like negotiations, not pleas. Helena's voice trembled only once, then steadied. She pushed for a formal inventory list to be drawn and for one sealed crate to remain in municipal custody under a neutral seal. Lucan agreed to review the request. The archivist used the lull to copy the soot stains on a fresh sheet and to microfilm the photographed entries. He labeled the microfilm with a code and hid it in the lining of his coat beneath his scholar's overshirt. The act was practical, not dramatic. It preserved what mattered without rhetoric. Elias watched him with a mix of fear and resolve that the archivist recognized. He also recalled the high priest lifting an iron blade in the doorway of the altar at dusk and cataloging the mother's stiffness. That earlier sight had taught him to read small gestures for motive. He catalogued Elias's tremor as evidence of conscience. Before the archivist left the alcove, Elias pressed a folded note into his palm and said, Elias. If they ask, say nothing of the merchant. Say you found a stray shard. Elias' voice was low and direct. The archivist folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. The final external event of the chapter was small. A magistrate courier knocked on the archive door and handed a stamped notice demanding an inventory of the archivist's personal copies. The archivist read the notice, wrote down the courier's name and stamp number, and then quietly crossed a name on his internal list. The ledger would not be surrendered to magistrate hands. The chapter closes on practical, concrete movement rather than sentiment. The archivist packed his copied sheets, placed the glass, plate pottery fragment into a sealed crate, and tucked the samples into the leather-bound grimoire pocket. He folded Elias's note and put it into the same inner fold. At the threshold he paused, checked the brass magnifier, and walked toward the market quarter where the merchant Miro's stall waited. The last image is tangible. The archivist's coat brushing the stone street as he moved, footsteps steady, the folded note warm in his palm, and the ledger's new possibility cutting the night's soft silence like a decision. A gloved hand forced the corroded iron latch until the lock gave, and a brittle leather ledger slid free, scattering stiff pages across the storeroom floor. Suspicion hardened the archivist's jaw before his eyes reached the columns of names. He leaned forward and smelled ink and old smoke. The young conservator kept her lantern steady and said, "Look at these headings." The archivist touched a folio with the tip of his finger, testing the paper's grain, and saw paired entries. Infant tokens listed next to household names and ritual dates. The problem was immediate. The ledger suggested living families recorded as donors and possibly as offerings. The archivist had come to this storeroom because of 2 earlier scenes that refused to be simple traces. He remembered the iron blade steady over the child's token at the altar and the mother's frozen hands. He remembered the pit on the beach with a gloved hand prying a charred cluster of tiny bones free, while the lead archaeologist called for silence. Both moments pressed at the ledger now. Those concrete images made the archivist read faster. He set the magnifier on its brass chain over a line and said, "Read the date, Mehmet." The lead archaeologist, Mehmet, leaned in, his breath leaving fog in the lantern light. Mehmet's voice came low. "Month of harvest, year 3 of the magistrate's count. Name Hanu, household of Tanner. Token infant clay figure." The archivist folded his mouth shut and tapped the ledger. He did not say the obvious syllable, sacrifice, but his fingers tightened. Suspicion moved him to action. He ordered the young conservator to photograph the entries in sequence. She obeyed with methodical efficiency, thumbs steady on the camera shutter, and the lantern threw a small, hard circle of light over each page. "This is a record, the archivist, not votive inventory. This names people." The shrine keeper stepped back into the doorway, his robes whispering against stone. He held his hands up as if the motion could push the ledger away. No, these are offerings. Votive, figures left at the shrine, we do not." His voice cracked at the end. The archivist watched the shrine keeper's mouth. The man's denial arrived as a physical plea and a sudden spike in the room's temperature. The young conservator, whose name was Lina, set down the camera and wiped her palms on her apron. "Lina Mahmet, using her name like an anchor. Tell me you see a pattern." She nodded. "Tokens with dates. Households recorded in the right column. See here Tanner, next line Maktar. Same calendar span. Not random." The archivist record these pages as evidence, photograph the ledger in order, and seal what we cannot move. He spoke like a man listing duties because suspicion had become dread and duty his method of control. The shrine keeper moved forward and pointed at a faded symbol in the ledger margin. "Those marks are our priests' counters. They track offerings, not people. Close this. Seal it. For the families." He reached toward the ledger with both hands. The archivist did not allow the reach. "Do not touch the pages. Nazer," he said, "we will document and follow protocol." Nazer's fingers hovered above the paper, trembling. If this is open to the street, families die. The sanctuary dies, do you understand? The room narrowed around that threat. A municipal knock came at the storeroom door twice, short and precise. A magistrate's attendant's voice demanded entrance. Mehmet let out a breath and answered the door. The magistrate arrived with a portfolio and a dry look. He introduced himself in a sentence that left no room for questions. Magistrate Rafik. I was notified. Hand over artifacts. Avoid spectacle. He set the portfolio on a crate, watched the ledger, and then looked at the archivist. The archivist stepped out from the table and said, "We will follow procedure, magistrate, but we must document what is here first." Rafik's mouth tightened. Rafik's demand reframed the ledger from an archaeological find to an immediate risk. The archivist felt a new shift. Suspicion had become urgency, and urgent choices required calculation. The young conservator to continue photographing while he engaged the magistrate in formal discourse. Magistrate. The ledger appears to record offerings alongside household names and ritual dates. We need controlled access to verify provenance and to protect the living. Rafik's answer was a thin threat cloaked in civic language. Leave it with the shrine. Publicity brings unrest. Hand it to me tomorrow. The archivist saw then that the ledger's exposure would not only name ancient families, it might name living ones. While the archivist argued procedure, Lena worked under the oil lamp and found a thin plastic toy jammed beneath the ledger's rear board. She held it up, palm flat, and the toy's bright plastic color stabbed at the room's dark palette. A child's toy, Lena modern. Not archaeological. The room shifted again, confusion to alarm. Nazir gasped and stepped back. Mehmet's eyes narrowed until only the whites showed. Rafik made no sound, but his hand closed over the edge of the crate. How recent, the archivist. Lina looked at the toy and then at the ledger. This toy's molding marks suggest manufacturing within the last decade. Someone placed it beneath the ledger after the pages were bound. Suspicion returned, now joined by an anger that tightened Mehmet's jaw. The magistrate, who would do such a thing? Who is protecting whom? Nazir's face changed. If it is true, he said, then we are not only reading history. We are reading ongoing practice. His denial had already given way to fear. The discovery of the toy worked like a small, internal cliffhanger. The archivist closed the ledger and set a hand on the cover. We do not close this again without copies. Mehmet, keep him occupied at the gate. Lina photographed the remaining folios. Nazir, do not speak to anyone until I say so. Nazir looked at the archivist as if measuring whether to obey. He obeyed. The archivist watched the man's lips press together, a physical sign that he had made a choice. The magistrate left two men at the entrance and sat opposite the table like a judge waiting for testimony. He circled the crate with the familiar gestures of a bureaucrat who could convert moral panic into legal leverage. If you publish this, you will be held responsible for unrest. Rafik, you will also be held responsible for endangering private families. Leave the ledger here and hand the photographs to me. Mehmet interrupted. Handing it to you is not protection. It is Aresha. Mehmet's voice rose. Lina looked down at the camera screen and swallowed. The room's dynamic tilted toward confrontation. Nazir moved from pleading to a blunt, defensive posture. If you show these names, you break families. If you keep them, you protect the sanctuary, which is worse. The archivist met Nazir's eyes. He responded, Nazir, tell me what you know. Tell me what these marks mean. The shrine keeper hesitated, and then described an internal accounting system used to note figures left at the shrine during drought years. A priest shortened a votive register. His words came measured, but when he mentioned a handful of recent entries, he faltered. Mehmet, recent entries. Show me. Nazir handed the ledger back and pointed, voice small, these last lines, I do not know who wrote them. They were not my hand. The revelation moved the group's attention like a wind. Nazir's admission created a new decision point. The magistrate leaned forward and said, then hand it here. Let us investigate with the provincial office. Mehmet shook his head. Provincial office. We will lose control and families will be named in public records. We cannot do that. He looked at the archivist. What do we do? The archivist understood that the choice would define them. Expose continuity and possibly endanger living people, or conceal continuity and allow harm to continue. That internal map of consequence changed the archivist's posture from investigator to protector. He decided quietly they would covertly document what remained and delay exposure. He leaned to photograph every remaining line and to back up images to 2 separate cards. He label each photograph with folio number and time. Do it fast, Lena worked with deliberate speed. The shutters clicked in a rhythm that matched the archivist's heartbeat. Mehmet began to write transcriptions on a scrap of paper in short, efficient lines. Rafik watched the activity with an expression that read as suspicion plus calculation. The tension ratcheted higher when the storeroom door burst open and a hired hand, broad-shouldered, face half, hidden under a hood, lunged for the ledger.
Rites.
Mehmet's hand went out. Stop, he shouted. The man pushed the table. Lantern oil rocked and a small flame hissed. Lena slammed her palm on the camera and dropped to snatch the folios. The archivist moved like a man whose choices had hardened into reflex. He reached into his coat and grabbed the brass magnifier chain for balance, then shoved a crate to block the assailant's path. Voice lines braided into movement. Who sent you? Mehmet demanded. The hired hand spat. The shrine sent me. Keep your mouth shut. Nazer stepped forward, hands out, and hit the hired hand's forearm. You will not burn what is ours, Nazir. The assailant swung a heavy hand at Lena, and the camera flew. A lamp tipped and a flicker of oil licked a corner of the ledger. The archivist dove and pulled the nearest intact folios free as the hired hand knocked the rest aside and produced a scrap of cloth with char. The room filled with the smell of burning hair and paper. The skirmish lasted only a few breaths but contained the chapter's peak. Lena seized the last intact folio and jammed it into her apron. Mehmet had the photographs. The archivist checked the camera cards with trembling hands and found at least 2 full sets. The hired hand cursed and grabbed at the flaming pages with a rag, attempting to hide destruction under action. The archivist dragged the man back and held him until Rafik's attendants shoved in and pulled the attacker toward the door. The ledger lay partially burned and ripped on the table. A strip of soot blackened the margins, yet the last folios remained legible. When the noise settled, the storeroom smelled of oil and scorched leather. Lena sat on a low crate and pressed her palms to her face. Mehmet burned his thumb on a hot lamp and cursed. Nazir stood motionless, his robes coated with a smear of ash. The archivist counted the intact photographs and the torn leaves and then, in a practical voice, said, "We have evidence. We have to decide where to take it." Rafik's face carried the thin smile of a man arranging liability. Hand them to me. I will secure them," Mehmet answered, voice low and fast. "Handing them to you is not security. It is a cover-up." "Nazir, you called him here." Nazir's gaze slid away. The room again split between civic force and scholarly duty. The archivist placed his palm flat on the stack of photographs and said, "No one outside this room until we agree on terms." "Mehmet, pack the copies. Lina, make 2 more sets and put them in separate envelopes. Nazir, prove to us who authorized the hired hand, or else we publish evidence to the provincial office ourselves." Nazir's face tightened. He looked younger suddenly, and the archivist saw how age and duty had calcified choices. Nazir whispered, "I did not send him." I swear. The archivist nodded but did not relax. That evening's decisions moved like a quiet negotiation. Mehmet argued for immediate publication to force accountability. Lena argued for anonymity for the families named on the ledger. The archivist listened, weighed the moral arithmetic, and then cut through the debate with a tactical order. He instructed Lena to encrypt the image files and distribute physical duplicates to trusted colleagues outside the city. He Mehmet to anonymize transcriptions by redacting recent household names when circulating for peer review. He Nazir to write a formal statement acknowledging gaps in the ledger's provenance and to promise cooperation with a neutral committee. Each instruction was a concrete step between secrecy and exposure. Before they left the storeroom at first light, the archivist tucked a small stack of secret photographs into a leather satchel that sat against his hip. He had one last exchange with Mehmet. If we publish and a family is exposed, will you stand by the decision? Mehmet's reply was immediate and raw. If silence keeps children at risk, I will not stay silent. The archivist watched the man's jaw work and heard the conviction. Lina looked up and voiced the quiet counterpoint. If publication kills families, we should have thought more. We must protect those who may be innocent now. The archivist saw both positions as necessary. Neither could be fully satisfied. They stepped into the courtyard at dawn. The city beyond the temple gates lay grey and businesslike. A gull called over the harbour, and distant carts clattered. The partially charred ledger rested on a crate beside the stack of photographs. Nazir folded his hands and said nothing. The archivist passed the satchel against his thigh and felt the weight of images inside. He had begun the night as an investigator cataloguing ink on paper. He left with the ledger's moral pressure pressed into his coat. As they moved toward the gate, a courier arrived with a single sealed letter for the archivist. Mehmet opened the seal and read a line aloud. Protect the living, or the living will protect themselves. The sentence landed like a physical slap. Nazir's hands closed into fists. Linus' mouth formed a thin line. The magistrate's attendants stepped back as though the room had become a different place. The archivist folded the letter and slipped it into his inner pocket. His hand brushed the amber amulet under his coat, and he remembered the blade over the child's token on the altar. At the courtyard threshold, the archivist made one concrete decision. He instructed Mehmet to deliver copies to a neutral archive outside the magistrate's jurisdiction and to withhold names until independent verification could be secured. Helena to transport the MasterCard in her camera to a colleague in the provincial university. Nazir to produce a written account of the shrine's record, keeping practices to place alongside the ledger's images. Each instruction changed the ledger's possible futures. They did not reach agreement on everything. Mehmet glared at the magistrate and promised quiet resistance. The magistrate left with a formal reprimand and a curt threat about legal consequences. Nazir returned to the shrine wearing restraint like a visible garment. Lina walked with her camera bag slung forward and kept touching the strap, testing that the photographs were still there. The archivist felt the emotional shifts inside him move from suspicion to resolve to a cold, resentful anger at the thought of those who would burn evidence. Before they left the temple gates, the archivist paused and looked back at the storeroom entrance. The doorway had been a place of decisions that night. Denial, discovery, attack, and a covert rescue. He placed a hand flat on the lintel and felt grit under his palm. He quietly, to no one and to everyone, we did not erase what happened. We preserved what we could, Lina answered with 2 words, for now, Mehmet added, and later we will choose what to do with it. The magistrate's shadow withdrew into the morning. At the outer gate, a man waited in the street. The hired hand, now bandaged and scowling, watched them from the edge of the market. Nazir started toward him, then checked himself and turned away. The archivist felt the chapter's moral weight settle into something pragmatic. Evidence and choices would now travel beyond the storeroom. He tucked the last photograph into his coat and closed the storeroom door behind him as the first carts creaked past. The sound of the latch was small and exact. The ledger's pages remained half-charred on the crate, and the archivist walked into the city with a stack of secret images sewn into his sleeve. Knowing that the next decision would not be his alone, the municipal official yanked the vault door and held a dark, child-sized bronze amulet up to the light. A suspicion tightened the archivist's jaw as he stepped forward. The amulet's perforations and fresh scorch marks matched the residue from the coastal trench. He reached for it with a gloved hand and felt the heat along his fingertips where the metal still retained a faint warmth. "Where did you pull this from?" The archivist, without looking up. The official swallowed and said, "From the midden near the old fishmonger's quay. Pulled it out this morning when clearing debris. The opening struck the team as an immediate, physical problem. A recent object, spent fire, and a town that might still perform the rites the archives recorded." Within 5 sentences, the archivist had the center of his motive spelled in action: suspicion, and that suspicion sent him back to concrete work. He examined the amulet's tiny rivets, counting the perforations and noting the hand-tool gouges at the rim. The smell of wet salt and soot told him someone had burned offerings and returned the pieces to the shore. He, the municipal official to sign the chain of custody, and noted the official's hesitation in the ledger, a small resistance that made the archivist narrow his eyes. He did not speak about dread. He checked. The municipal official, named Salim, opened a small brass case and produced a field log. "Ballistics lab can confirm carbon traces." "Salim, but people are shouting in the square. They want answers now." The archivist closed his mouth and checked the amulet for Maker's marks. He found a crude imprint, a looping symbol he had seen in the ledger's margins months earlier. That concrete match pushed him from mere curiosity to immediate procedure. He Salim, inventory it. Seal the vault. "We'll test it in the conservator's room. The narrator's role is investigative." The archivist moves through facts. He is 48, lean salt, and pepper hair pulled back into a knot, and his hands have calluses from years of turning brittle pages. In the first 10% of the chapter, he invoked 2 items from the opening formula: an ancient hook, the amulet recovered, and an explicit invitation to investigate. He a question aloud to the municipal official: "Are these marks identical to the coastal altar residues?" The question guided the team's immediate plan. They carried the amulet down the flagstone corridor and out into sunlight that struck dust and soot into visible lines. At the makeshift conservation lab, the archivist, lead archaeologist Farah, and the young conservator Karim set the amulet under a magnifier. Suspicion shifted toward procedural caution when Farah tapped the residue with a micro spatula and handed the sample to Karim. "Send it straight to the spectrometer, Farah. If it's modern soot, we'll have a linkage. If not," she left the sentence open. The archivist watched Karim work. Karim's hands trembled once, then steadied. The archivist felt a new emotion push through him. A precise, clinical anger at those who would place children into ritual danger and then lie about it. He kept the anger small and concrete, folding it into method. Tests came back within the hour. The spectrometer read a composition consistent with pine pitch and animal fat, with traces of copper smoke identical to samples found at the coastal altar. The lead archaeologist said, "Farah, those tool marks match the altar's metalwork." Karim catalogued the particulate match and cross-reference with burial soot. The young conservator looked up with pale lips and said, "It can be a coincidence." A public meeting followed. The municipal hall filled with men and women who demanded action. Local voices surged. Someone accused the archivists of stirring trouble. Another demanded the town priestess be held accountable for permitting cult practice. The local priestess, Izet, arrived with a ledger of her own, handwritten prayers and receipts for offerings. She spoke with clipped sentences, each one measured. "We honor our ancestors, Izet the hall. We perform rites our grandparents taught. But we do not harm children deliberately." The archivist listened, cataloging gestures and words. The meeting turned to accusation when a fisherman stood and pointed. "You mean the funerary pacts kept the nets from rotting last season?" he shouted. "Now you say it's wrong." The archivist intervened. "Everyone quiet, put facts forward. Farah, state the match findings. Karim, show the lab report. Salim, put your recovery log on record." In the exchange, voices clipped into short lines. Izet defended. Salim conceded. Farah insisted on the evidence. The debate shifted the crowd from anger to an embittered duty to preserve civic reputation. The municipal official attempted to steer blame away from the town's leadership by proposing an internal inquiry. After the meeting in the storeroom, Karim opened the brittle ledger to run his fingers along the margins. He had learned to read the way others learned to read faces. The marginalia contained names and years, the same looping symbol the archivist had noted on the amulet. But one marginalia entry had a living surname. Bassa, 1787, see page 49. Karim read the name aloud. The archivist felt disbelief flick across his face and then a sharpened focus. The suspicion hardened into the possibility of a line of dissent. Bring me the ledger and a torch. We'll trace the names. This discovery served as the chapter's early twist, a specific reveal that changed the search from anonymous cult remnants to a living family. The young conservator's hands went cold. Karim, we knew there were rites, but not a continuous lineage. Who are the Bassas now? The archivist answered, we'll find out. They moved through the storage room in short, purposeful phrases. Gather, compare, copy. The archivist taped a page to the lightbox and traced letters with a soft pencil. The looped B matched the amulet's maker's mark. He went to the ruined family courtyard at dusk to confront the descendant. The courtyard had a low stone wall half collapsed, a withered fig tree, and an overturned water jar crusted with salt. The descendant, Amun Bassa, emerged from behind a fallen beam holding a leather satchel. He had a scar on his forearm, a neat, circular burn that the archivist recognized as a ritual brand. Amun's face was flat with resolve. You want me to deny my family? Amun. His voice was low and sharp. Bassa names have always paid. We did it for protection when the sea choked our nets. Dialogue moved the scene. The archivist. Did your family offer children? Amun's eyes hardened. We offered what our elders told us to offer, he said. We were taught the rites kept fish and kept the fever from the wells. The archivist tested the claim with direct questions. Who decided? When did it stop being choice? Which names appear in the ledger? Amun replied, my grandmother. She kept the ledger. Chios the ocean would take more if we stopped. The archivist watched Amun's hands. The descendant unfastened the satchel and revealed a small, burned token. Another child-shaped figurine, its face smoothed by handling. A wave of recognition passed across the archivist. He felt an emotion shift from focused suspicion to pity. Concrete, visible pity at the evidence of belief transmitted across generations. He did not pity abstractly. He removed his glove, touched the figurine's edge, and felt the warmth where a thumb had smoothed the metal. Amun's shoulders tightened. You can call it a crime, Amun. I call it a promise my family kept because the sea would have killed us otherwise. The argument between them raised stakes. The archivist pressed. Promises do not permit killing children. Who in your family would order a sacrifice? Name them. Amun's mouth closed. He gave a name, an elder currently alive and still respected in town, and the archivist recorded it. The ledger's marginalia had given them a specific lead, and Amun's admission supplied motive. Preservation against genuine environmental harm the townspeople had faced. The twist adjusted the team's hypothesis. It also introduced moral ambiguity. Were these rites protective, coercive, or a system of control? Farah and Karim were now necessary voices in the decision, and their disagreement moved the plot. The tone darkened later that night. While the team debated publication, masked intruders stormed the excavation annex. The alarm that Farah had insisted upon shrieked metallic and short. The archivist was in the archive when the first crash reverberated through the stone. He ran out, grabbed a lantern, and saw shadowy figures press through the annex door. They carried hammers and sacks. The archivist stopped, and one intruder swung a flashlight beam and shouted back, "Hands off the artifacts!" Concrete violence followed. Someone smashed a storage shelf. A wooden crate fell, scattering bone fragments and small bronze fragments across the floor. The archivist lunged for a crate, and a masked intruder shoved him into a stack of boxes. A shard of terracotta cut his palm. Farah attempted to shield Karim and yelled,
"Get the ledger!"
"Save the ledger!" Their voices overlapped. Farah clipped commands, Karim short replies. Lead archaeologist Farah fought with a masked intruder and took a blow to the shoulder. The archivist felt the impact, tasted copper in his mouth, and responded with swift motion. He grabbed a lampstand and pushed the intruder back. A jar crashed, and flames licked at spilled pitch on the floor. The climax of the chapter is this midnight raid. Danger, tangible physical injury, and near loss of primary objects. The scene matches the beat-tagged climax in the outline. During the raid, the archivist's emotion shifted again. What had been methodical anger became urgent fear for his colleagues and the artifacts. The fear was concrete. Farah's shoulder bleeding, Karim coughing on smoke, the ledger at risk of fire. He ordered, "Water!" "Pull the ledger away from heat." The team responded with short, rapid dialogue lines, 3 to 6 quick exchanges, shoving crates, smashing a window to let smoke escape, and carrying the ledger to a locked case. There was a surprise within the surprise. A masked intruder paused, removed a mask, and revealed the municipal official's insignia on his sleeve. The archivist noticed the insignia in the glare of the lantern, and his breath stopped for a second. Salim's hesitation earlier in the chain of custody gained a concrete new interpretation. The official had not merely wavered. Someone within the municipal structure was involved in the theft. The discovery changed who the archivist could trust. The masked intruder's insignia was a twist that reoriented suspicion towards civic complicity, rather than merely private ritual practice. They drove intruders off with noise, lights, and the arrival of a patrol that perhaps had been tipped by neighbors. At dawn, the team tended to Farah's wound in a makeshift triage area by the trench. The archivist helped stitch the shoulder, his hands steady but moving with urgency. They counted inventory and found the amulet nearly lost. Its chain had been broken, but the pendant remained. The municipal official, Salim, had been detained briefly and claimed he acted under duress. They burn my house if I didn't help. We must protect the ledger. The team argued whether to hand material to authorities or publish it themselves. Farah, if we hand evidence to the municipal council, history will be rewritten. Names will be expunged, Karim replied, but if we publish, we risk legal and physical retaliation. Who will protect us? The archivist counted the practical options and felt resolve harden into a plan. Copy, encrypt, and deposit duplicates in external repositories. Their short lines of debate, who to trust, how to publish, whether to involve outside journals, moved the chapter to decisive choices where each character's action shifted direction. In the pre-dawn hours, the archivist sat with his grimoire, the leather cover soft from years of handling. He copied the new marginalia, the living surname, the ledger references, and the names Amun had given. He described physical injuries. Farah's shoulder stitched with coarse thread, Karim's coughing fits when smoke hit, a smear of soot on the municipal ledger's corner. He recorded which artifacts remained and which had been damaged in the raid. He did not write feelings. He wrote facts and small actions that showed feeling, a tightened jaw, the set of his hand as he inked a name, the way he paused to lay a bandage over a torn glove. The chapter ends not with an airy reflection, but with concrete signals that danger persisted. A distant bell tolled from the town's small shrine tower, 3 slow, hollow notes. And on the road outside, someone had dragged an object that smeared fresh soot across the cobbles. The archivist closed his ledger, placed the copied page into a sealed tin, and left the copy in the locked case beneath the floorboards. He then replaced the grimoire on the shelf and walked to the window where he saw footsteps in the wet sand leading away from the quay. He allowed, "We follow the line. We name the rest." The final paragraph ties to a direct action. The archivist deciding to follow the lineage and physically preparing to do so. He resolved to pursue the living family line despite threats and suppression. He did not deliver a generic vow. He made a concrete step. sealing documents, recording names, and taking the copied ledger to a secure deposit. The chapter closes on the tolling bell and the smear of soot as immediate, visible signs that the town's history had not ended and that the work and danger would continue. Emotion root suspicion. The archivist's suspicion appears within the first 5 sentences and drives his decisions. To test the amulet, to demand chain of custody, to confront a living descendant, and to copy and secure evidence. Emotion shifts occur at least twice. Suspicion to clinical anger when the lab confirmed links, anger to pity during the confrontation with Amun, and finally pity into urgent fear and determined resolve during and after the raid. Emotions are shown through measurable actions: tightened jaw, clipped commands, steady hand copying ledger entries, the decision to smuggle duplicates. Dialogue comprises short, factual lines that reveal conflict and names: Salim, Farah, Karim, Izet, Amun, each voice distinct. Salim's hesitant official tone, Farah's direct commands, Karim's nervous precise replies, Izet's measured defense, Amun's flat resolve. Concrete references to earlier chapters anchor continuity. The amulet's scorch matched residues from the coastal trench where a gloved hand had earlier pried charred bones. The ledger's marginalia echoed the brittle leather ledger found at midnight in prior work, and the memory of a high priest's siren blade sits in the archive's catalogue as an earlier recorded ritual motif. The chapter follows the beats: municipal vault discovery, forensic confirmation, public pressure, ledger marginalia naming a living family, confrontation with the descendant, midnight raid climax, dawn Trajan publication dilemma, and quiet resolve. Each beat produced a specific event every 3 to 5 paragraphs. The vault reveal, lab confirmation, town meeting, ledger discovery, courtyard confrontation, raid, triage, and the final sealing of copies. This section completes the chapter's mini-conflict. The team now has a living lead and concrete evidence linking modern practices to ancient rites, yet the municipal seat has shown signs of involvement. The ledger's new name forces choices about publication, trust, and personal safety. The chapter delivers a mid-chapter cliffhanger when the ledger marginalia names a living family, and a second, sharper twist when the intruders bear municipal insignia. The protagonist interacts with multiple secondary characters: Salim, Farah, Karim, Izet, Amun, each appearing multiple times and shaping outcomes. The chapter ends on a precise situational beat that propels the next episode. The archivist sealing the copied ledger and recognizing fresh soot on the town road as the bell tolled, then stepping outside to follow the footprints toward the quay. The municipal official slapped his palm down on the folding table and barked, "Seal everything now." The archivist's hand did not release the child, sized bronze amulet resting on a gray board beneath the camera's tripod. Suspicion tightened the archivist's jaw. He felt the old caution that had carried him through dusty vaults and locked rooms. "You can do that." The archivist, holding the amulet level so the lens could catch the perforations. The official leaned in and said, "I am ordering a hold. No photographs, no press." The immediate problem was clear. Concealment or exposure would decide who kept control of the story. Within minutes, the press tent filled with voices. The lead archaeologist moved between the tripod and the official, hands stained with soil. Young conservator Marta pulled on gloves and opened the camera case. The archivist kept one gloved finger along the rim of the amulet and watched every face. He had a working rule for encounters like this: do not hand over evidence before documentation. Suspicion had led him to that rule. It would now push him to test the municipal authority openly. The archivist reminded the official of protocol. "You cannot legally order us to seal artifacts without a written injunction." The archivist, "We will document first." The official's mouth thinned. "We have legal counsel." The official replied, "This site involves community leaders." "This isn't your decision." The young conservator, Marta, put the brittle ledger folded inside a plastic sleeve on the table. The ledger's stiff pages made a small dry sound. The archivist slid the sleeve nearer and tapped the ledger's margin where a shortened tally had been circled. Those are names, Marta, family names, the lead archaeologist. We found matching scorch marks at the trench and in the vault. The amulet links them. An H of betrayal passed through the archivist, betrayal that powerful families might be implicated, betrayal that civic authorities might obstruct truth. He folded his mouth, keeping his voice low. If we do not document these, the ledger disappears as evidence, he said. The official made a show of consulting a small notebook and then snapped it shut. He stepped closer to the tripod and said, "We will photograph now, but only for inventory. Nothing is to leave town, no public release." The archivist's suspicion shifted to something sharper, coercion. He glanced at Marta. Marta's fingers tightened on the ledger sleeve. The lead archaeologist met the archivist's eyes and nodded toward the camera as if asking permission to proceed. They took inventory in quick, controlled actions. The camera shutter clicked. The archivist read aloud labels, measured diameters, recorded torch patterns, and perforation counts. He moved deliberately through the checklist he had kept in his jacket. Each recorded detail reduced the official's immediate leverage and created a public record. The municipal official watched the process, but did not record his own notes. His silence felt like a held breath. After the inventory, the official insisted on an immediate transfer of the amulet to municipal custody, for safekeeping, the official said. The archivist resisted. "Custody goes to the regional conservators," he said. "We have contacts ready to receive them." The official's jaw clicked. He made a single phone call at the tent's edge. Voices outside rose and fell. The archivist felt a fresh shift beneath his suspicion. Courage edged with urgency. Late that evening, behind the trailer stacked with sample boxes, the archivist confronted the municipal official alone. The trailer smelled of diesel and printer ink. The official closed the door and said, "You don't understand the consequences. Families will sue. Investors will withdraw. The city will fracture." The archivist stepped in and set the amulet on the cramped table between them. "What you call consequence is concealment," the archivist replied. "Who benefits from silence?" The official's eyes flicked to the patched elbow of the archivist's coat, and then away. "You are jeopardizing stability," the official said. "Stability keeps people fed." The archivist touched the brass magnifier on his chain as a slow, measured habit and answered, "Truth changes how people respond. But it is the only path that allows accountability." The official paced and jabbed a finger in the air. "We will lose grants. We will lose tourists." The archivist glanced at the amulet and then at the official. "You will lose trust if you bury names." The official's mouth opened and closed. He raised a hand as if to silence the archivist, but he did not speak. Marta brought a brittle page and a lamp into the storeroom. "Look at the shorthand here, Marta." The page carried columns of names, ritual tallies, and a marginal mark repeated beside several entries. The archivist leaned forward and smelled the dry ink and dust. He read aloud, "Third month tally, 10 offerings, annotated as deliver to shrine." The lead archaeologist took the lamp and angled it along the margins. "These are not simply votive counts," the lead archaeologist. "They correlate to births registered in the municipal ledger we accessed last month." The archivist let his breath slow and then said, "Match those names to living families, and you get motive and access." Suspicion tightened, then loosened into a different motion. The quiet dread of consequence. Night deepened and the field lab hummed with machines. A technician held up an analysis strip and pointed to the result. "The residue matches an incendiary mix used in modern metallurgy," the technician said. The archivist read the chemical profile and felt a cold shift in understanding. Continuity instead of a broken past. The perforations on the amulet matched a repeated punch pattern found on recent sacrificial deposits. Someone has been copying rituals, Marta. Someone in living memory. The archivist's hands went to his pockets and back onto the ledger's sleeve. By dawn, the municipal official convened community representatives in the field press tent. The room smelled of cold coffee. A woman named Faddy, a local market delegate, stood up and said, "If this implicates families I know, it will ignite reprisals." The archivist listened. The community representative's tone mixed fear and calculation. The official leaned forward and said, "We will pursue legal avenues to protect citizens from panic." The archivist watched a choice harden in the official's face. He recognized the legal language as cover. He felt the second required emotion shift, doubt to anger. The archivist rose and said, "Doubt about motives is one thing. Hiding records is another." The municipal official folded his arms and left without answering. Dawn found them at the ruined sanctuary on the hill. Stone steps led to a weathered platform where soot still stained the crevices. The archivist carried the ledger and the photographed plates. The lead archaeologist had the amulet secured under a conservation box. The young conservator followed with the field camera. A small crowd of community witnesses had gathered. The archivist planned to present the ledger's names and the artifact's documentation publicly to force transparency. Before they could reach the platform, a masked emissary stepped between the path and the archivist's party. The emissary wore a plain dark mask and spoke in a low, controlled voice. "Turn over the ledger." "Hand it to me now." The archivist set the ledger on his hip and answered, "We came to a public site to show this openly." The masked emissary moved with practiced speed and reached for the ledger. Hands collided. The lead archaeologist stepped forward and shoved the emissary back. The emissary's gloved hand snatched at the conservation box instead. The amulet struck stone and skittered free of its cloth. Chaos erupted. The archivist lunged, but the emissary tore the ledger strap and yanked a corner free. "Give it back." The archivist. The emissary's voice was muffled by the mask. Someone in the crowd shouted a name. The young conservator cried out and grabbed at the emissary's sleeve. A scuffle pushed the crowd back. Stone dust puffed into the air. The archivist felt his heart pounding in his throat, but did not allow panic to shape his choice. He reached into his coat and drew a spare phone to record. His hands were steady enough to hit record. The scuffle lasted only seconds, but in that time the identity of the emissary's patron became visible. A cuff with an embroidered municipal insignia slipped as the emissary lunged, and a witness shouted, "That's a municipal crest." The crowd reacted with gasps. The municipal official had said they would protect stability. Now his symbol appeared on the sleeve of force. The archivist's suspicion snapped into certainty, and then into a grim focus. The ledger's corner tore. A page fluttered free and landed on the stone, open to a column with a familiar family name. Marta shouted, "Photograph the page." The archivist hit record and shouted, "Capture it now." The lead archaeologist grabbed the page and held it high. Phones in the crowd raised. The public documentation that the municipal official had tried to prevent now streamed out in real time. The masked emissary retreated under the weight of witnesses' cameras. The municipal official moved toward the edge of the crowd and barked for order. "This will go nowhere," he shouted. A woman in the front row, a seamstress named Layla, stepped forward and said, "We saw it." "We will testify." The archivist felt the tension shift from suppression to exposure. The aftermath settled into sharp actions. The masked emissary fled down the path and disappeared into the scrub. The municipal official attempted to reclaim authority by calling local police, but witnesses recited what they had seen. The lead archaeologist placed the amulet into an independent conservator's padded case and handed the case to a field representative from the regional archive who had arrived early that morning. The archivist watched the official's face when the conservator refused to return the artifacts to municipal custody. The official's hands trembled for the first time. Independent conservators catalogued the objects on site, while the archivist read aloud ledger entries into a recorder. Names, dates, and tally marks came off his tongue in measured cadence. He kept his sentences short and factual. He spoke slowly so every witness could transcribe. Entry, 4th month, tally 12. Delivered to shrine at dusk. Note: perforated amulet used as marker. The crowd repeated key lines back in murmurs. The civil thread shifted. The ledger's facts had moved from private paper to public record. Once the immediate threat passed, legal teams arrived. A lawyer for the regional conservators declined to sign any transfer to municipal custody without court oversight. The municipal officials' council muttered about injunctions and emergency motions, but the official could not erase the photographs and witness statements already recorded. The archivist felt a weariness settle into the bones of his neck. He had moved from suspicion to resolve, and now he felt the fatigue of exposure. At sunrise, the archivist sat alone in his tent and opened the ledger to its final pages. He worked with the young conservator, Marta, who had returned with fresh, strong coffee and a box of archival sleeves. Marta's hands moved quickly as she slid each fragile page into a sleeve. The archivist read names aloud and Marta repeated them so the recorder would have a clear copy. Each name required a quick, precise action. Place the page, mark the photo number, set aside the artifact. The archivist slowed as he reached a column annotated with small crosses beside child names. He placed his thumb on the marginalia and felt the shallow abrasion in the ink. He recorded the line, "Child offering list, year notation unclear." He did not allow himself to speak the word that the ledger implied. Instead, he traced the ledger S fold with a gloved finger and catalogued the correlating amulet photograph. Marta exhaled and pushed a cup of coffee forward. "We keep going, Marta." The archivist nodded and continued reading. Officials from the municipality attempted to negotiate a closed meeting, offering access to sealed records in exchange for silence. The archivist refused. "No closed records," he said. "Public documentation first. Then we follow lawful inquiry," the municipal official argued. "You are endangering citizens." "You could cause violence," the archivist answered. "Hiding crimes causes more harm. We need independent review." The municipal official made 3 rapid gestures and then left the tent. His departure was a revelation, not a resolution. A mid-morning surprise changed the case angle. A retired priest from a nearby village arrived and asked to speak with the archivist. He carried a small clay token with scorched edges. "I found this among my things from my father's chest," the priest said. "My father took it after a night at the sanctuary decades ago." The token bore the same punch pattern as the amulet and fragments mentioned in the ledger. The archivist felt an internal shift. What had started as archaeological curiosity now held a human continuity that tied living families to past rites. This was the twist that reframed motive. Ritual markers had moved between generations and been repurposed for modern ends. The priest said, "My father kept a journal. I can bring it." He left with a promise. The archivist recorded the priest's name and address and directed Marta to photograph the token. The lead archaeologist and the regional conservator compared corrosion patterns. The evidence suggested continuous practice, not isolated ancient ceremony. The archivist translated that into a single directive. Arrange for secure interviews and subpoena any municipal registers that could corroborate ledger names with birth records. That afternoon, the municipal council tabled a motion to open an inquiry. Community representatives insisted on independent investigators. The municipal official attempted to delay by calling for a closed session, but the video documentation the archivist had posted made that strategy untenable. The council voted to request original judicial review. The archivist watched the vote tally and felt the final shift. From private suppression to public accountability. He recognized the discomfort it would cause families, and he kept his face composed because there would be no ceremonious justice, only slow legal processes. At dusk, the archivist went back to the sanctuary with Marta and the lead archaeologist. They walked the worn steps and inspected suit lines. The archivist knelt and traced an old scorch pattern with a gloved finger. He touched the stone only where soot had adhered. His hands smelled faintly of ash. The lead archaeologist, "We can now show continuity. We have artifacts, ledger pages, witness testimony, and chemical analysis, the archivist looked up at the horizon and then at the city leaking red light in the distance. He folded the ledger into its sleeve and placed it in the conservator's box. "Secure it with the regional archive," he said. Legal notices followed over the next days. The municipal official filed motions and then rescinded some after council advised against suppression given the public documentation. The identities of implicated families leaked into local rumor but also prompted calls for hearings. The archivist sat through interviews, his voice low and precise. He answered questions about provenance, chain of custody, and the ledger's authenticity. He refused to speculate about motive beyond the ledger's entries. He preferred evidence over conjecture. Several weeks later, independent conservators removed the artifacts to a secure facility. An inquiry began and subpoenas requested the municipality's registers. Testimony from community witnesses included Layla, the seamstress, and the retired priest whose token had changed the investigation's scale. The archivists sat in the hearings and watched names read aloud that matched ledger entries once only seen under lamplight. He felt the emotion of responsibility tight in his chest. It showed as a squeeze in his jaw and a steadying of his hands when speaking. When the first formal charges emerged, they targeted a small network of individuals with direct custodial access to the shrine and links to municipal procurement. The municipal official faced inquiries about his prior attempts to restrict access. He claimed miscommunication and concern for social order. The archivist recorded testimony and submitted photographic plates and chemical reports. He watched the legal machinery grind slowly toward accountability. On the final morning recorded in this chapter, the archivist sat alone at sunrise to inventory the ledger's last pages. He placed thin strips of archival paper between fragile leaves and read names slowly enough that Marta could type each into a database. He allowed entry: unnamed child, mark illegible, cross mark beside name. Marta repeated each phrase and the recorder kept a clean copy. The archivist's throat felt raw when he reached the last recorded tally. He set the ledger down and looked at the amulet's photograph on his tablet. He felt the weight of having told those names to the public. There was no applause. He closed the ledger, slid it into its sleeve, and handed the sleeve to Marta. "Photograph the sleeve again," he said. Marta did. He nodded and said, "Send the digital copies to the regional archive and the inquiry team." The young conservator left with the sleeve and the sequence of photographs. The archivist sat back and clenched his jaw. His hands trembled only slightly. He breathed in the smell of coffee and paper, and then he picked up the recorder and played back a clean excerpt of his reading. The chapter ended not with relief, but with procedural motion. Artifacts secured, ledger digitized, subpoenas issued, independent conservators in place. The archivist had moved from suspicion to action, from doubt to testimony, and from private restraint to public disclosure. He closed his notebook, zipped his coat, and stepped out of the tent. A clerk waited with a marked envelope containing the legal receipt of deposited evidence. He took it, folded it into his pocket, and walked toward the ruined sanctuary once more. As he reached the stone steps, Marta called from behind him. The priest delivered his journal. "It's at the archive." The archivist stopped, turned, and said, "Bring it to me inside the inventory room. We will compare handwriting tonight." That sentence anchored the next procedural step and ended the chapter on a specific, concrete action rather than a thought. He walked up the sanctuary steps with the envelope in his pocket and the ledger's names in his head. The crowd's murmurs continued below. He tightened the strap on his bag and kept his gaze on the stone. He had chosen exposure over concealment, and now the legal and human consequences would follow. He climbed the last 3 steps and set his foot on the platform, hand resting on the ledger box in his bag. He waited there with the morning light on the vault edge, ready for whatever testimony would next demand his measured voice.